When Tim Scott accused Vivek Ramaswamy of not understanding working-class struggles and claimed he had privilege blindness, he thought he had delivered the perfect establishment attack. Scott sat back with satisfaction, expecting his audience to cheer, while Vivek crumbled under moral pressure. But Scott had made a fatal mistake. He had just accused someone who actually built businesses of being out of touch, while hiding his own Wall Street connections. Vivek's devastating response about Scott's corporate sellout record would silence the fake populist forever. The Heritage Foundation's annual Economic Policy Summit was in full swing at the luxurious Mayflower Hotel in downtown Washington. The elegant ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and ornate decorations, was filled with the kind of conservative establishment figures who had dominated Republican economic policy for decades. The panel discussion titled Conservative Economics for Working Families featured several prominent Republican figures discussing how conservative policies could address the economic challenges facing ordinary Americans. It was supposed to be a showcase of Republican unity on economic issues, demonstrating how the party could appeal to working-class voters while maintaining its pro-business principles. Tim Scott sat at the panel table with the confidence that had made him one of the Republican Party's most prominent voices on economic issues. As the only Black Republican senator, Scott had built his political brand on a compelling personal story of rising from poverty to political prominence, becoming a powerful advocate for conservative economic policies. Scott's perfectly tailored suit and polished demeanor projected the image of someone who had successfully navigated both the business world and political arena. He had cultivated relationships with major corporate donors while maintaining his image as someone who understood the struggles of working families from personal experience. Across the table sat Vivek Ramaswamy, who had been invited to represent the perspective of successful entrepreneurs who had built businesses outside the traditional Republican establishment. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his demeanor calm but alert, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had achieved success through innovation rather than political connections. The panel had proceeded through various discussions about tax policy, regulatory reform, and economic growth strategies. Most of the conversation had been cordial, with panelists offering different perspectives on how conservative principles could be applied to contemporary economic challenges. That's when Scott decided to make his move. He had been observing Vivek throughout the discussion, clearly viewing him as a threat to his own positioning as the authentic voice of conservative economic populism. Scott sensed an opportunity to establish his superiority when the conversation turned to the question of which policies would most benefit working families. "I think we need to be honest about something here," Scott began, his voice taking on that familiar tone of moral authority that had made him a favorite among conservative audiences. "We need to ask ourselves who really understands the struggles that working families face in today's economy." The setup was classic Scott, positioning himself as the authentic voice of working-class concerns while preparing to attack someone he viewed as disconnected from ordinary Americans. The audience of conservative policy experts and donors leaned forward with interest, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "We have people in this room who talk about helping working families, who propose policies that they claim will benefit ordinary Americans," Scott continued, his voice growing more pointed. "But I have to ask, do they really understand what it's like to struggle? Do they really know what it means to worry about paying rent, to choose between groceries and gas, to wonder if there will be opportunities for their children?" The attack was becoming more personal, and everyone in the ballroom could sense that Scott was building toward a specific target. This wasn't going to be a general discussion about economic empathy. This was going to be a directed assault designed to establish Scott's credentials while undermining a rival. "We have people who have been successful in business, and I respect that success," Scott said, his gaze beginning to settle on Vivek. "But success can sometimes create a bubble, a disconnect from the realities that most Americans face every day. Wealth can breed a kind of blindness to the struggles of people who haven't had the same opportunities, the same advantages, the same lucky breaks." The audience murmured with anticipation, recognizing that Scott was preparing to challenge Vivek's credibility as a voice for working families despite his business success. "Vivek," Scott said, turning to face him directly, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "You've built a successful company. You've made a lot of money, and I genuinely respect your business achievements. But I have to ask you, do you really understand what working families are going through in this economy?" The question was loaded with implication, suggesting that Vivek's wealth had somehow disqualified him from understanding or representing the interests of ordinary Americans. "Because from where I sit," Scott continued, his voice rising with conviction, "you look like someone who has been insulated from the real struggles that working families face. You look like an out-of-touch billionaire who doesn't understand working-class struggles, who has never had to worry about making ends meet, who has never experienced the kind of economic insecurity that defines life for millions of Americans." The attack was direct and personal, designed to paint Vivek as an elite figure who was fundamentally disconnected from the experiences of the people he claimed to want to help. "You talk about conservative economic policies," Scott continued, "but do you understand what it's like when those policies don't work? Do you know what it's like when the economy fails people who are working hard and playing by the rules? Do you understand the human cost of economic theories that look good on paper, but don't translate into real opportunities for real families?" The moral dimension of the attack was clear, with Scott positioning himself as someone who understood both the policy details and the human impact of economic decisions. "Because, frankly," Scott said, his voice reaching a crescendo, "I think you suffer from privilege blindness. I think your success has created a barrier between you and the realities that most Americans face. I think you see economic issues through the lens of someone who has never had to struggle, who has never faced real economic hardship, who has never worried about whether there would be food on the table or a roof over your family's head." The ballroom erupted in murmurs of appreciation, and Scott sat back in his chair with satisfaction, clearly expecting his attack to be received as a powerful defense of working families against elite indifference. But what Scott didn't realize was that he had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had assumed that his personal story and his reputation as a champion of working families would be enough to intimidate someone he clearly viewed as just another wealthy businessman playing at politics. He had no idea that he was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on his own record of serving corporate interests while maintaining a populist facade. "Tim," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the ballroom pay attention, "I appreciate your concern about privilege and your passion for working families. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think everyone here deserves to hear your answer." The tone of the confrontation was shifting, and Scott's confident expression began to falter slightly. He had expected Vivek to become defensive about his wealth or to offer some weak justification that would only make Scott's attack look stronger. Instead, Vivek was turning the tables and going on the offensive. "You just accused me of privilege blindness and suggested that my success has disconnected me from working-class struggles," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You positioned yourself as the authentic voice of working families against wealthy elites who don't understand their struggles." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Tim, who do you really work for? When you vote in the Senate, when you make policy decisions, when you choose which interest to prioritize, are you really representing working families? Or are you representing the corporate donors who fund your campaigns and the Wall Street interests that have bought your loyalty?" The question hit the ballroom like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these panel discussions usually went. Establishment Republicans were supposed to be able to attack outsiders without having their own loyalties questioned in return. "Because when I look at your donor list," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the ballroom with unmistakable authority, "I don't see working families. I see Wall Street banks, I see multinational corporations, I see exactly the kind of special interests that have rigged the system against the working families you claim to represent." He pulled out his phone, and the gesture was both theatrical and ominous. "Let me share some facts with this audience of policy experts. According to Federal Election Commission records, your top donors include Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and virtually every major Wall Street firm that has profited from the financialization of the American economy. The ballroom was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from conservative solidarity to shocked attention. Scott sat rigid in his chair, his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized where this was heading. Goldman Sachs alone has donated over $200,000 to your campaigns and PACs, Vivek continued, consulting his phone. These are the same Wall Street firms that got bailed out while working families lost their homes, that profited from speculation while working families saw their savings evaporate, that engineered the financial crises that devastated working communities across America. The specific financial details were devastating because they highlighted the fundamental contradiction between Scott's populist rhetoric and his actual funding sources. But it gets worse, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. Let's talk about your voting record on issues that actually affect working families. You voted against limiting credit card interest rates that trap working families in debt. You voted against breaking up the big banks that are too big to fail. You voted for trade deals that shipped working-class jobs overseas. The voting record was particularly damaging because it showed a consistent pattern of supporting corporate interests over working-class concerns despite Scott's populist messaging. You called me out of touch, Vivek continued, but let's talk about what being in touch with working families actually looks like. Being in touch means creating jobs, not just talking about them. It means building businesses that employ people, not just voting on policies that affect them. The distinction between actual job creation and political rhetoric was becoming clear, and everyone in the ballroom could see the fundamental difference between business achievement and political positioning. My pharmaceutical company employs over 1,500 people, Vivek said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Research scientists, manufacturing workers, administrative staff, sales representatives. All of them earning good wages, all of them building careers, all of them supporting families through productive work that creates value for society. The specific employment numbers were powerful because they represented real people with real livelihoods, not abstract policy discussions or campaign talking points. These aren't government jobs that depend on taxpayer funding, Vivek continued. These aren't make-work programs that disappear when political priorities change. These are private sector jobs that create wealth, generate innovation, and contribute to economic growth that benefits everyone. The contrast between private sector job creation and government employment was stark and undeniable, highlighting the fundamental difference between creating wealth and redistributing it. But here's what really bothers me about your attack, Tim, Vivek said, his voice becoming more pointed. You're not just attacking my success. You're attacking the very idea that business success qualifies someone to understand economic policy. You're suggesting that creating jobs somehow disqualifies someone from representing working families. The philosophical attack on business experience was being exposed as fundamentally contrary to conservative principles of achievement and entrepreneurship. That's not just wrong, Vivek continued. That's dangerous. That's exactly the kind of thinking that has given us a political class that talks about working families without understanding how jobs are actually created, that promises economic solutions without knowing how the economy actually works. The broader critique of career politicians was resonating throughout the ballroom, as audience members recognized the truth about how political careerism had contributed to economic policy failures. And let's talk about your supposed understanding of working-class struggles, Vivek said, pulling out another document. You've been in politics for over a decade, Tim. You've been making a government salary, enjoying government benefits, living in the Washington bubble. When was the last time you actually worked a job where your paycheck depended on creating value for customers? The attack on Scott's disconnect from private sector work was particularly effective because it highlighted how career politicians became isolated from the economic realities they claimed to understand. When was the last time you had to meet payroll? Vivek asked. When was the last time you had to worry about keeping a business afloat during an economic downturn? When was the last time you had to compete in a market where failure meant losing your own money? The questions were devastating because they highlighted Scott's fundamental lack of experience with the economic risks and responsibilities that defined life for business owners and their employees. Your entire adult career has been in politics, Vivek continued. You went from local politics to state politics to federal politics. You've never built the business, never created jobs in the private sector, never taken the financial risks that come with actually employing people. The systematic exposure of Scott's career politician status was particularly damaging because it contradicted his claims to understand working-class economic struggles. Yet you feel qualified to lecture entrepreneurs about understanding working families, Vivek said, his voice rising with indignation. You feel entitled to attack job creators while you've never created a job yourself. You feel comfortable criticizing business success while your own success has come entirely through political positioning and corporate donations. The hypocrisy was being exposed in real time, showing how Scott's attack on business success was fundamentally inconsistent with his own reliance on corporate funding. But here's what really exposes your fake populism, Vivek continued, his momentum building. While you've been attacking me for being disconnected from working families, you've been voting consistently for policies that benefit your Wall Street donors at the expense of working families. The accusation of fake populism was particularly powerful because it went to the heart of Scott's political brand and public image. You supported the bank bailouts that socialized losses while privatizing profits, Vivek said. You voted for trade policies that benefited multinational corporations while devastating American manufacturing communities. You opposed financial regulations that would have protected working families from predatory lending practices. The pattern of serving corporate interests while claiming to represent working families was being documented in detail, showing the systematic nature of Scott's betrayal of his populist messaging. And let's talk about your relationship with the lobbying industry, Vivek continued, pulling out what appeared to be his most damaging evidence. Your campaign has received hundreds of thousands of dollars from registered lobbyists representing the very industries that have rigged the system against working families. The lobbying connections were particularly damaging because they highlighted how Scott was directly funded by the special interests he claimed to oppose. Pharmaceutical lobbyists, defense contractor lobbyists, Wall Street lobbyists, Vivek said, consulting his document. These are the people who fund your campaigns, who give you access to elite fundraising networks, who ensure that your political career remains financially viable. The systematic exposure of Scott's donor network was devastating because it showed how his political success depended on exactly the kind of special interest influence that harmed working families. So when you call me out of touch, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what's more out of touch? Someone who creates jobs for working families through private sector innovation? Or someone who takes money from Wall Street while voting for policies that ship those jobs overseas? The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental difference between creating opportunities and destroying them while claiming to represent working interests. You want to know what real privilege blindness looks like? Vivek asked, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. It's a career politician who has never worried about making payroll lecturing job creators about understanding working families. It's someone who takes money from Wall Street banks attacking business owners for being disconnected from working-class struggles. The role reversal was complete, and everyone in the ballroom could see how Scott's accusations had backfired spectacularly. Real privilege blindness is thinking that political position and corporate funding give you more credibility to speak for working families than actually employing working families, Vivek continued. It's believing that government salary and Wall Street donations make you more authentic than private sector job creation and business success. The systematic deconstruction of Scott's moral authority was particularly effective because it used his own standards against him, showing how his behavior contradicted his rhetoric. And you know what I find most insulting about your approach? Vivek asked, his voice taking on a tone of genuine anger. You're not just attacking my business success. You're attacking the entire concept that success in America should be celebrated rather than penalized, that achievement should be rewarded rather than punished. The broader cultural attack on American success was being exposed as fundamentally anti-American in its implications. You're promoting the idea that wealth creation is somehow immoral, Vivek said, that business success automatically disqualifies someone from representing working families, that the only authentic path to political leadership is through government service and corporate donations. The anti-success mentality was being highlighted as contrary to fundamental American values of entrepreneurship and achievement. That's not conservative economics, Tim, Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger. That's socialist rhetoric disguised as populism. That's the kind of thinking that discourages innovation, penalizes success, and ultimately hurts the working families you claim to represent. The ideological critique was particularly powerful because it showed how Scott's approach contradicted basic conservative principles about the role of business in creating prosperity. Working families don't need more career politicians who take money from Wall Street while attacking job creators, Vivek said. They need leaders who understand how to create opportunities, how to build businesses, how to generate the wealth that makes good jobs possible. The positive vision of business-led economic growth was a stark contrast to Scott's government-centric approach, highlighting what authentic pro-worker policies could look like. So Tim, Vivek said, beginning to conclude his response, the next time you want to attack someone for being out of touch with working families, maybe you should examine your own donor list and voting record. The next time you want to lecture someone about privilege blindness, maybe you should consider how your own political privilege has isolated you from the economic realities that working families face. He gathered his thoughts for his final statement. And the next time you want to attack business success as somehow disqualifying for political leadership, maybe you should ask yourself whether working families would rather be represented by someone who creates jobs or someone who takes money from the interests that ship those jobs overseas. His final words would echo in that ballroom long after the panel was over. I'll keep building businesses, creating jobs, and fighting for policies that actually help working families build better lives through their own effort and achievement. You can keep taking Wall Street money while attacking the job creators who employ the families you claim to represent. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Scott sat motionless in his chair, his populist authority completely destroyed by the exposure of his corporate donor network and anti-business voting record. His attack on business success had backfired spectacularly, revealing the hollow foundation of his working-class messaging. The audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly recognizing the fundamental contradictions in Scott's approach that Vivek had exposed. The panel had become an education in the difference between authentic representation of working families and corporate-funded populist theater. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Tim Scott had exposed something crucial about modern Republican politics: the tension between genuine pro-worker policies and corporate-funded populist messaging that served special interests while claiming to represent working families. It had highlighted how establishment Republicans often attacked business success while taking money from the very corporate interests that had rigged the system against working Americans. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the populist rhetoric in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that working families were better served by leaders who created jobs than by politicians who took money from the interests that destroyed them, and that authentic representation required actual achievement rather than just political positioning and corporate funding. The age of fake populist authority was over. The age of demanding authenticity from political leaders had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a corporate-funded senator from South Carolina with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about who he really worked for.